Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and in this one, we're going to be talking about the Flash family. But before we get into that, smash like, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. That helps us out on our end with the YouTube algorithm, but also we love hearing from you guys. We have an awesome community here, and it's all thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. So, having said all that, I want to start off actually with kind of a metaphor so that the superhero stuff makes sense. I'm first going to tell you about how I used to play Dungeons and Dragons. And in my humble opinion, I'd argue that I was playing it the wrong way and what I learned from that experience, and then how we applied it to gaming in general, and then specifically how it applied to this game, right? So, and I'll try to be fast and make this painless. So, when I was a kid playing D&D, we would do a campaign that usually ended in something like we would slay a dragon, right? And the dragon, we would find it in some kind of a gigantic cave and it would be laying on this massive pile of gold, right? Kind of like what you see in The Hobbit, basically. And after we had defeated the bad guy, the dungeon master would tell us, here's how much gold there is. For the sake of argument, again, I'm painting with broad strokes because this is just a metaphor, right? For the sake of argument, let's say there's 1,000,000 gold pieces. And also, since we're painting in broad strokes, let's just say each one weighs 1 pound, right? So there's 1,000,000 gold pieces in this cavern. There is 1,000,000 pounds of treasure in this hypothetical cavern. So as kids, what we would do is we'd say, great, we divide it 4 ways. We take it back to town. We go to the local general store or whatever, and give me the book. I want to see what is the nicest armor in the book. I want to buy that. What's the nicest shield? What's the nicest sword, etc. Right? Well, so that was fine when we were kids, but then as we got older, and like when we were in high school, we started to play with some guys who were in college, and we would see the way they played. Or when we were in college, we started playing with guys who were like in their 30s or whatever, and we were seeing how those guys were playing. And we started to notice it's like, hey, wait a minute. Um, a gold piece doesn't weigh nothing. I can't pick up a giant pile of something and just take it back to town with me, right? There's problems here. Like, first of all, if I fill my backpack, I keep wanting to say book bag. If I fill my backpack to the brim with gold, and I take that, let's say I take it back to the inn where I rented a room. What do you do? Do you pour it out on the floor in there? And then are you going to leave that unsupervised when you leave the inn? Is somebody going to go in your room and say, great, free gold, right? And just take it? You can say I locked the door, but D&D is full of thieves with picklocking and stuff, right? Not to mention somebody who works there that is goes in and cleans during the day or whatever. Um, and also then when you leave the cavern, you're leaving that unattended. And now the monsters are all dead, so there's nothing to keep bandits away or whatever, right? So what happens when somebody wanders in there and finds that stuff? Even if they don't find it on your first trip back and forth from the dungeon to town, what if they find it on the third trip or the fourth trip or whatever? What are you doing about this? In other words, do you hire some kind of a guard to guard the cave entrance? Does he know what's in there? How much are you paying this guy? Are you going to pay him 500 gold and he cares more about that than he does about the 1,000,000 gold pieces that are inside the cave? You see what I'm saying? Um, so in Dungeons and Dragons, oftentimes the dungeon master will give the players a riddle that they have to figure that out somehow, right? Or maybe inside the dungeon itself, there's square tiles that can be slid back and forth on some kind of like a track system. And maybe each one has a different sigil or hieroglyphic on it or whatever, and you gotta move them into the right order to get like a door to open or something, right? Problem solving, in other words, is a huge part of the role playing experience. So I learned from all that and I apply that to my role playing games pretty often, actually. So after the Shaper of Worlds destroyed the government and all government property, right? We started to talk about like, well, what does that actually mean? You know? And like one of the things that came up was we were talking about sewers of all things. And I said, the main pipe in the sewer is government property, right? So it would be like deleted. Granted, the pipes off of that go to your residence, that's private property. Those pipes would still exist. But do the sewers start to flood? Like we had a conversation about the Ninja Turtles in New York, and like would their lair start flooding with water and sewage and so on and so forth. And how high do those levels go? Do they come out of storm drains and manhole covers? Like, that, and that's only talking about the mainline sewer pipe getting deleted, right? That's one thing that the player characters have to deal with. And I talked about, I said, so if there are no more police cars to pull you over for speeding, how likely is it that people are going to start speeding? And then you follow that up with the idea of, if everybody is speeding, are there going to be more car accidents? And then you follow that up by saying, that said, who responds to an accident now? Right? And hospitals, by the way, some people were confused about this in the recent games I posted. We did a little research, and some hospitals are private. A lot of the ones that start with the word saint, for instance, are private because of like a separation of church and state thing. So there are um, hospitals in major cities that were founded by some kind of a religious organization way back when. It seems like they'd be fine, actually, that their power generators would still exist and so on and so forth. But there are other hospitals that are government based, according to Google. If I'm wrong about this, that's yeah, I'm citing my source. But at any rate, yes, some of those would have major issues, right? They would lose power at the very least, and so on and so forth. And then their ambulances, we were talking about that, where the ambulance wouldn't exist, or fire trucks would no longer exist, and so in other words, it's we suddenly have kind of gone from me having what was basically writer's block to seemingly no end of things for the players to have to contend with. And so one of those ideas was I said, if you can't be arrested for revenge, think of all the people where somebody wronged them, but now they can't be arrested. We would have kind of a purge situation on our hands, right? And even if you're not talking about revenge, what about just greed? Like granted, there's going to be people who are like, I'm going to go to the store and stock up on canned goods because the supply chain has been destroyed, right? But aside from the, I need a loaf of bread to feed my family, which that's very different than the guy who says, you know what, I want a big screen TV or I want a PS5 or whatever. So there, all of this stuff is going on. And so I tell this to the players and I was like, I know you guys feel overwhelmed, but we're gonna run a bunch of games that are all gonna take place basically simultaneously. But you guys let me know how do you want to deal with this? Where do you want to start? Right? And so my son, interestingly enough, said, this looks like a job for the Flash. I said, interesting. And so for me to explain his thinking, I'm going to really quickly tell you how super speed works in DC Heroes, which is the game we play 99% of the time. So let's say let's say that you are a speedster and that we'll use Torch as our example. Torch was a guy in our game who had super speed and fire. He could accelerate stuff and make it catch fire, molecules in the air and things like that. I mean, point being, Torch is a great example, right? Torch had about 7 APs of super speed, which meant he was about as fast as like a Lamborghini or a Ferrari or something like that, like his top running speed. In DC Heroes, that's 7 APs of super speed, right? Let's say that Torch was in college and that his professor gave him something he had to read that night. But of course, reading this thing for an hour is going to get in the way of him going out and fighting crime, right? So he's going to use his super speed to reduce the amount of time it takes to read the thing. So everything in DC Heroes is measured in APs. That stands for attribute points. It's just a super generic unit of measure, and they literally apply it to everything ever, whether it's time or weight or data volume or anything, right? And so an hour of time, 1 hour is 10 APs of time. Okay. So if Torch has 7 APs of super speed, what we would do is we would take that 10 and we would subtract 7 from it, which gives us 3. And so what that tells us is it would only take Torch 3 APs of time to read that stuff the professor gave him for homework, right? 3 APs of time, by the way, is 32 seconds. So, in other words, it takes everybody else in his class an hour to read this thing. It only takes Torch about half a minute, and he's done. And now he can go fight crime, right? That is how super speed works in DC, where you reduce the amount of time it takes to do a thing by how many APs of super speed you have. Okay, so the Barry Allen Flash, who is the guy my son was talking about, in our game, and obviously there's a multiverse, there's an infinite number of universes out there. There's technically an infinite number of Barry Allens out there. And in the various continuities over the years, Barry has different speeds that he can run at. Um, DC Heroes lists him at 25 APs of speed, which he can then push under special circumstances to get up to light speed. Um, for the longest time, it was kind of a word of mouth thing. Just everybody that I knew described the Flash as running at the speed of light. So on Earth K, we give our Barry Allen 29 APs of super speed, which is exactly the speed of light, right? So when we were talking about how long is it going to take Barry to fix all this, I like if he's running around and he's dealing with, let's just start with looting, people stealing flat screen TVs, right? If you can move at 29 APs of speed, how long does it actually take to stop all of the looters? And let's forget for a minute that like the handcuffs have been deleted when the government was done away with, right? The police handcuffs. You can't just run over to a cop, take a handcuff, and make that somehow work. So there are so many variables here. I brought in AI to help us, and I know that's going to make a lot of people mad, but I was like, look, just do the math for me, so I don't have to do the math. How long is it going to take the Flash to do this? I can't remember the answer it gave me now. It was something like 16 years. And I was like, really? And I'm like running at the speed of light. And I was using ChatGPT, and ChatGPT was very familiar with Barry Allen. Uh, and I told him, our Barry can literally just run at the speed of light at will. And it was like, got it. Here's and it broke down, several paragraphs worth of, here's the math. The answer is it's going to take him years. And I was like, okay, well, thankfully it's not Barry by himself. And it's like, okay, so that changes it. And it's like, so who all is working on the problem? And I said, all the speedsters are. And in our game, the Golden Age Flash was Jay Garrick. He had died. Now he's back. We mentioned that the dead heroes had returned to life recently. Um, he had a daughter named Judy. She then had a son who she named Jay Garrick II, right? Because that's how our game world works. I've talked about that in a bunch of other adventures. That was kind of the doing of the Scarlet Witch. She wished things were like they used to be because as the game world was getting bad, and I don't mean that in the sense of, because a lot of people take that as like in real life, older people like myself, I'll cite myself as an example. We miss the good old days. I miss hanging out with my friends at the mall, right? That's not what we're talking about with the Scarlet Witch. We're talking about extreme events like a crisis, like Blackest Night, Marvel Zombies, you know what I mean? Um, yeah. So she subconsciously had kind of caused a bunch of the comic book characters in our game world that when they were having kids, they were naming them after the people that were no longer around, because she was trying to bring back the heroes. My son, by the way, had an interesting idea, which was that none of that was quite doing it. And the ultimate fruition of what she was doing was the recent event where the dead actually came back. Um, that she was kind of unsatisfied with the level things were at. And now, this is happening. So I thought that was very interesting. But at any rate, I'm a little off topic. The point is that so just going with the Jay Garrick character alone, we've got Jay, his daughter, and his grandson, right? So that's three heroes, all just derived from the Jay Garrick end of the spectrum. With Barry Allen, Barry married Iris in the 50s. They had twins, Dawn and Dawn. By the way, they were referred to in the comics as the Tornado Twins. By the way, this comes up too because a lot of people kind of watch my channel because they like comic book history. So I should just specify that in the comics, to the best of my knowledge, neither Dawn nor Dawn ever actually put on a Flash costume and called themselves the Flash. They called themselves the Tornado Twins. They did stuff in the Legion of Superheroes era, 1,000 years into the future. They both wore purple. They both had red hair. I was not into that myself. If that's your thing, more power to you. I just felt like it was a missed opportunity and that I wanted to see them doing more traditional Flash stuff. So in our game, that's what we did. So Barry's son, Dawn, Don, the male, is also back from the dead. He had been, because how do I want to put this? Wally West was Barry's sidekick in the Silver Age, right? So a lot of the stuff later in the timeline, because again, we use real time in our game rather than comic book time. So that meant Wally was going to be too old to do stuff when you kind of wanted there to be a Wally. So we kind of used Donald Allen to sort of fill that void. So some of the stuff with like the Teen Titans later on, by the way, when you went there to be a Kid Flash and some of those stories, that was Donald Allen for us. You know what I mean? But then he also died. Um, but he's back. His sister Dawn, Dawn, she's back. She was a female Flash in our game for a while. Um, and then she has a son that she named after her dad, right? And Barry's real name, by the way, is Bartholomew. So her son is named that, but then he goes by Bart. This is another moment where I need to split hairs briefly. In the comics, Bart Allen, also known as Impulse, is actually the son of Donald Allen, right? So we're kind of switching up in our game, which Don is the parent there. The end result was we really wanted sort of a Barry Allen the second, right, to take the place of the original Barry. Um, but sometimes we refer to him as Bart just kind of out of habit because we're used to seeing a grandson of Barry running around named Bart. So you get it. And as always, if this is confusing, because I know I'm hitting you with kind of a lot of information here. If this is confusing, just say something in the comments section and I'll try to do a better job. Okay, so then Barry married Iris. Their nephew was Wally West. Um, and I'm referring to the original Wally West from like the Silver Age that was like a guy with red hair. In our game, he grew up, he got married. He had a daughter who he named Iris after his aunt Iris. So she's Iris West. We see her in Kingdom Come, by the way. She also is a redhead. Um, we featured her as the Kid Flash of the 90s. Interestingly enough, she was basically played by Greg Sheets before Kingdom Come came out in 1996. When that came out, Greg was really weirded out by um, what are the sheer chances that somebody else created my RPG character? Um, but yeah, then she, like everybody else, has a son that she names after her dad. So then he's Wally West the second, and he looks just like the original Wally West, where he's got the red hair and stuff. So he's running around, no pun intended. But you get the idea. So we end up looking at this. Oh, and I left one out. Johnny Quick is back. He married Liberty Bell. They have a daughter that in our game, she was Jessie Quick. That's what she was doing in the 90s. That's when we were using her in the game. Um, Years later in the comics, she changed her name. She was the new Liberty Bell. We did not do that. We kept her as Jessie Quick. She also, interestingly enough, was the Flash briefly, and I actually really liked that. I thought that was kind of cool and wish that would have stuck around longer. But then she has a son and a daughter, and they are named Johnny Quick and Liberty Bell, right? So you get the idea, though. You can kind of add up here how many um supers there are, right? And we applied that to, again, we go into Chat GPT and we're like, okay, now here's the list of characters. Here's everybody's APs of speed. How long does it take them to deal with the problem? And it still came back with the answer of, with all of them working together, it would take 1 year. And I was like, holy crap, like really, and it broke down all the math, which would be a really long, tedious, boring thing for me to read to you. But I was like, okay. Um, so my wife and I played a game. She played the daughter of Barry Allen, Dawn with a Dawn, right? So she's the main character we're going to be talking about from here on out. Everybody's doing stuff. I had, my son rolled some dice to punch out some thieves, and you know what I mean. Um, Dawn, interestingly enough, she's like, I go find a person who is looting, and she's like, if people are stealing bread because they're trying to stay alive, they are not my priority. Her priority is like the guy who is stealing an Xbox or something, right? And so she's like, I want to knock that guy out. And I was like, great, roll the dice. And she does. She knocks a guy out. And the way I tend to run it is that you're moving so fast, the world just seems like it's paused. Time is still moving. It's just moving so slow. You know what I mean? And so she really can't see it. As she's running around through the world, it just seems like everybody's statues, and you know what I mean? And so she rolls to punch a guy out, and it's super easy for her to do, barely an inconvenience. She lays him out, but then it's like she's like, I want to handcuff him. And I'm like, well, where are you going to get handcuffs? And so she like runs to the police station, and it's in shambles because of what Shaper of Worlds did. And there's like nothing usable here at all. And she's like, okay, well, that's a problem. So she ends up going to an adult store and getting a pair of like fuzzy pink handcuffs, runs back, puts these on this guy who was the looter, and she handcuffs him around how do I want to say it? It's like if there's like a traffic light over the street, connected by a wire, then on either side of the street going up and down is like a pole. That's what she handcuffed this guy to. So that when he wakes up from getting knocked out, he's still like how are you getting off of this pole, right? And so she does this to a bunch of other people, and pretty quick she runs out of fuzzy handcuffs, right? So she runs to like a Lowe's or a Home Depot or something like that, and she gets rope. And then her thing is, I'm going to tie a guy's wrist together with rope. But then the next guy, like I'm going to basically position all these guys so they're all like facing in the same direction. and I'm going to go down the line, wrapping rope around each set of wrists, tying the knot in such a way that now there's another few feet of rope before we get to the next set of wrists, and then I loop it around those, and you know what I mean? So she's creating these long kind of chains of criminals that have been tied up. This is still not really working as well as she'd like, though, right? And so then there's this interesting bit where she remembers Professor Dalton's duplicator ray, and she tries to go get that, and um, she can't. Uh, which by the way, I realized over the years we had made a mistake where we had it in two places at once. We have mentioned that it's on the SDF-1, which is in Tokyo Harbor, and she forgot all about that one. And then we also, though, said there's another one in the Fortress of Solitude because the Professor Dalton's duplicator array was used back in the day to create the first Bizarro. And it was back in the Superboy comics. It was designed to perfectly replicate non-living matter. Okay. Someone accidentally uses it on Superboy, and it creates Bizarro Superboy, who grows up to be Bizarro Superman, right? That was the continuity of the time. So people have used this duplicator array a lot in our game over the years to reproduce something like a pair of handcuffs, which is where this is going, right? And it works great as long as the stuff is, made of metal or plastic or glass or something like that, right? It can swing that no problem. As soon as you try to use it on like a person, it creates a Bizarro version of that person. In the comics, we had, interestingly enough, Bizarro JFK, Bizarro Marilyn Monroe. There were a lot of Bizarros back in the day. Um, Also, if you try to use it on like a steak, which comes from a cow, like if you use it on a cow, you're going to get a Bizarro cow, right? If you use it on steak, you're going to get Bizarro steak, right? And we didn't even want to have to tackle what happens if you eat Bizarro steak. Like, is that okay for you? Because I think its attempt to replicate living cells is I think it actually creates inorganic crystals in the shape of the living cells. So like eating Bizarro steak might actually like literally tear up your intestines and stuff where you get all these little micro cuts from sharp jagged crystals and blah 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 blah, right? So we kind of didn't even want to go there. But so over the years, though, we realized the problem was there were two duplicate arrays. So we had decided that the reason why there were two duplicate arrays is that Superman, who can fly through time, at one point had shot the duplicate array with the duplicate array, right? That he had like picked it up, gone back in time a day, created a second one. And so that was our excuse for why there's one on the SDF-1 and there's one in the Fortress of Solitude. Point being, the female Dawn, Alan, runs to the Fortress of Solitude, wanting to grab that duplicator ray, and she forgot about the whole thing where there's this gigantic gold key out front. You got to be as strong as Superman to lift the key. So she's like, crap, what do I do now? And so she got this idea that was awesome. And that is that she remembers a Flash villain named Mirror Master. And Mirror Master, over the years in comics and cartoons and video games and stuff like that, they've kind of been all over the place with what his powers are, right? Um, so in our game, I kind of took all of those things and said our Mirror Master can kind of do all of that stuff. And he has this gadget called the Mirror Gun. And so she remembers the Mirror Gun, and the Mirror Gun is actually a better version of the duplicator ray she was trying to get because the Mirror Gun works on organic matter. Because I want to say it was in the Super Friends cartoon, we saw where Mirror Master can sort of shoot himself with this device, and it's like he hits copy, and then he can hit paste over and over again, and he can have an army of Mirror Masters. And in some of the later continuities, they say, well, like if the Flash punches one of them, it shatters into glass like a mirror, or it does this or it does that. That hasn't always been the case, though. There's some versions where it is a flesh and blood, it's just a clone, right? Um, and actually, I would argue that at the quantum level, they're probably identical, which means they're both equally original, right? And of course, Mirror Master would refer to it as his reflection or whatever. You get the gist. But so she remembered the mirror gun, and she's like, "Well, hey, awesome. Where would that be these days?" And I was like, "The Flash Museum." And she's like, of course, like, of course it would be. And we've also seen that too, where the Flash Museum doesn't just display props used by the villains, it displays their actual gear. Because sometimes the villains break out of Iron Heights and they go to the Flash Museum to rob it to get their old stuff back. And Flash shows up to deal with them, hijinks ensue, yada, yada, yada. You get the gist. So the female Flash, runs to the Flash Museum, goes in, gets the mirror gun. And the other thing I always liked about the mirror gun, and they did this on Super Friends, and then they did it again on Justice League Unlimited, which was a great show. I miss that cartoon. Both of them. I thought they were both awesome cartoons. But at any rate, in both of those, we saw the same thing happen, which is that as long as there's a reflective surface somewhere nearby, ideally a mirror, but it can also be the front of a skyscraper. Sometimes they have the two-way glass windows or whatever that looks like a mirror. It could be a mud or like a puddle of water in a pothole might be reflective enough that that would work. But as long as there's some sort of a reflective surface around where you can see your own image, Mirror Master had the ability to shoot that with the mirror gun, and it sort of turns it into a portal. And he jumps through, assuming that this mirror is big enough a person could get through it. If it's like a 4 foot by 4 foot mirror or whatever, obviously he can get in there. If it's like a 1 foot by 1 foot mirror, he's probably not making it. But you get the gist. He goes through it into the mirror dimension, and that's always fascinated me. And I think this is based on, I feel like a lot of little kids have gone up and touched a mirror when they were young, and they wondered, like, is this actually what it is? Or is there another dimension here and there's another me looking back at me and we're just doing the same stuff at the same time? And a lot of kids play with their reflection where they're hoping, like, maybe I'll look to the right and he won't, or vice versa, or whatever. I remember doing that as a kid. Um, and I've also seen that in horror movies, by the way, where they play with that idea. So I think that's where this came from in the comics. Well, so the idea then is that you go through into the mirror dimension, and the way it's been done in the cartoons is it's like this infinite realm of just like the color black. It is completely dark in here, right? And there is this thing that you can walk on, kind of like a sidewalk. It seems to also be sort of silver, and it reflects, no pun intended, it kind of reflects the theme of mirrors in terms of its color, and it's smooth, and you know what I mean? But it goes up and down a little bit. There's hills in it, and this thing seems to be a gigantic Mobius strip. And it's a path that the Flash can run on. And then on the sides of the path, if you think about it, kind of like if there was a sidewalk up against a wall, right? Where the wall should be, there is nothing. It seems to just be empty space. But I don't know how to word this. Mounted on this non-existent wall is then a bunch of mirrors. So as Flash is running, the mirrors are about head height, where Flash can look through, and it's a portal to our world. So just one random mirror somewhere in the world, right? And so oftentimes in cartoons, Mirror Master would crap the Flash in this realm. He would have to run around at super speed, find a mirror that would allow him to go back out again somewhere. Or I guess without the mirror gun, you can't just get out. You need the mirror gun to turn that mirror into a portal. So Mirror Master can do stuff like if there's like the Central City Diamond Exchange and they lock the front doors at night, he can come out of the mirror in the restroom, rob the place, go back in that mirror, right? And then the next morning they don't understand how he got in and out when the door was locked the whole time. That's sort of the gist there. Well, so when our female Flash goes into the mirror dimension because she can use the mirror gun to turn the mirror into a portal. She goes in there, she's on the Mobius strip. She does the thing I mentioned before that is the copy and paste thing to herself. And she makes a ton of female Flashes, who, by the way, all have their own mirror gun. And then they all pick a mirror that corresponds to a random mirror somewhere in our world, and they go out of them. And so now there's an army of female Flashes all over the world, right? And we go back to Chat GPT and we're like, okay, now how long is it going to take? And we end up with a much lower number, where it's like we can now do this in a matter of minutes. So all of the female Flashes are running around everywhere. And by the way, they now that they've got mirror guns, they can start to duplicate the few handcuffs that they have. They end up going back to the Batcave and using it on Batman's bat cuffs, which are just handcuffs shaped kind of like a bat. But at any rate, and then they duplicate the duplicates and so on and so forth. And so they have all the bat cuffs they could possibly want. They go around uh and basically they handcuff everybody to poles like I was talking about earlier. But now they're seeing these people stealing bread and stuff like that. So they start to create care baskets and they start to use the mirror gun on food. And that works. Earlier I was saying, the Bizarro thing would probably not be fantastic, you know, but the mirror gun is great, you know. It can completely replicate living matter. So they do that, and they start to like literally like there's a female Flash knocking on like every door everywhere, not in the exact same moment, but you know what I mean. And when people go to the door, there's a gift basket, and it's the groceries they need to get by for a few days. And then the female Flashes are saying, this doesn't have to be a one-time thing. We can do this again pretty soon. Oh, I left an entire part out, which is when my wife was trying to do all this. Um, we borrowed a page from the Wally West Flash, which is, yes, he can run from, New York to California real quick, but he is starving, right? Because he just burnt through all the calories that it would take to do that. And typically, the Barry Allen Flash didn't need to do that. But a lot of my players just kind of like the eating thing. So most of them, when they have played a Flash in my game for a long period of time, they just say, my Flash does that. I'm like, that's fine, kind of hand wave it off. Well, so in this case, though, as she was trying to solve the problems, I was like, okay, so now you're super hungry and what are you going to eat? It was kind of like, well, I run to like an apple orchard and I eat an apple, or whatever. I run to a citrus grove and I eat an orange. But she couldn't get enough to eat for all the stuff she had to do, right? So the mirror gun solved that problem too. Now it's like I go to the apple orchard, I pick an apple, and I make a bazillion apples using the mirror gun. And then that's gonna give them the energy they need to do all the stuff they need to do. But yeah, I mean that was the adventure. I feel like the this went on longer than I had hoped it would, but there was kind of a lot I felt like I needed to explain. But yeah, that was this one. This one was fun for us. I hope that you liked it. If so, as always, we'd love it if you took just a quick moment of your time to smash like, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. Have you ever ran a game with the Flash? Have you ever ran a game with Mirror Master? Did you ever see cartoons with these characters that you liked, or a favorite issue of the comic? Whatever the case may be, I would love to hear about it. And from all of us here at the longest running superhero game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure.